Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to Bray Town Hall and the final event of our second day of the festival, of our 18 events. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Rónán, Hession and Nuala O'Connor, two winners of the One Dublin One book, we call the event One Dublin Two Books, who are sponsoring this event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all invite Rónán up to read a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about his book, invite Nuala, talk a little bit about her book, then ask them a few questions in common, and then we throw it open to the public. That's the order of events. So I thought I'd introduce both together, so I won't be jacking the boxing in between. So Rónán Hession has published two novels to date, Leonard and Hungry Paul and Panenka, both of which have been shortlisted for several major awards in Ireland and the UK. He's currently working on his third novel, Ghost Mountain, but I think you've completed a draft. I think I saw you posting, or whatever it was, great, which will be published in 2024. And Nuala O'Connor's fifth novel, Nora, from New Ireland, about Nora Barnacle and James Joyce, was a top 10 historical novel in the New York Times, and obviously One Dublin One book choice for this year. Yeah, I should have said Leonard and Hungry Paul was last year. Nuala curated the Ulysses 100 exhibition at Moley, the Museum of Literature, Love Says Bloom, and she's also editor of the flash fiction e-journal Splunk. So, without further ado, can I invite Rónán up to read a little bit from Leonard and Hungry Paul.
Thanks, David, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming. So I'm going to start, just going to read the opening section of Leonard and Hungry Paul, and then I'll read a short section later so you get a sense of each of the two main characters. So I'll start at the beginning, chapter 1, Leonard. Leonard was raised by his mother alone, with cheerfully concealed difficulty, his father having died tragically during childbirth. Though she was not by nature the soldiering type, she taught him to look at life as a daisy chain of small events, each of which could be made manageable in its own way. She was a person for whom kindness was a very ordinary thing, who believed that the only acceptable excuse for not having a bird feeder in the back garden was that you had one in the front garden. As sometimes happens with boys who prefer games to sports, Leonard had few friends but lots of ideas. His mother understood with intuitive good sense that children like Leonard just need someone to listen to them. They would set off to the shops discussing conger eels and have a deep conversation about Saturn's moons on the way back. They would talk about tidal waves at bath time and say goodnight with a quick chat about the man with the longest fingernails in the Guinness Book of World Records. But Leonard grew up at a time when quiet, imaginative children did not yet enjoy the presumption of innocence. His mother often found herself having to take his side against ornery teachers who complained that they found it impossible to get through to him. With patient maternal endurance, she would sit by herself at parent-teacher meetings explaining that, like his late father, he just lacked a eureka face. Even into his 30s, Leonard's mother still liked to fuss over him, buying his favourite ham for lunch, the one with fewer veins running through it, leaving tea by the bedside for when he woke up, and ironing well-meaning creases into his jeans, which Leonard would quietly iron out later. He repaid her thoughtfulness by keeping her company through her later years, and generally including her in the uncrowded bandwidth of his life. Leonard was not exactly sure, but there must have come a point when their relationship grew from a purely filial one into one of partnership. Though an adult son living with his widowed mother is a situation about which society has yet to adopt a formal position, it is clearly seen in second-best terms. Insofar as anyone noticed, they might have assumed that she was overbearing or that he lacked initiative and possibly a sex drive. In reality, neither sought to limit or interfere with the other, both being independent people who liked their own space and who, quite simply, got along. Leonard did recall some awkwardness around the suggestion that they go on holidays together, though he was not entirely certain which of them had first proposed it. Mother-daughter holidays are normal, of course, and father-son trips are famously storied as a way to come of age. Mother-son holidays, though, have the connotation that one of them must be a burden on the other. But truth be told, they were well suited as travelling companions. She was a keen walker and a good gallery feat, being able to wander around any reasonable exhibition in its entirety without being distracted by the gift shop honeypot that drew in tired women half her age. They both liked churches, and even though Leonard was not religious himself, much of the world's art is. He would enjoy visiting famous paintings and sculptures in European cathedrals, while his mother would busy herself, lighting a candle in the side chapel for her fragile, long-departed husband. She had never really asked Leonard about girls, knowing the delicacy of the subject for him, and also because of her own doubts about whether his apparently celibate life was due to a lack of interest or opportunity. For Leonard, the fact that he still lived at home with his mother led to a certain self-restraint on practical grounds. He had wondered what would have happened had he brought a girl home, only for them to wake up to 2 cups of tea at the bedside the next morning. His mother passed away unexpectedly one midweek night in her sleep, tucked into a duvet with her clothes all laid out for the next day, her neatness being a sign of her respect for the small things in her life. The doctor noted the cause of death as heart attack, but emphasised that there were no signs of suffering or drama. He said that her heart must have simply run out of beats. So that's the opening section where we get to meet Leonard. I'm going to just read a little bit from a later section. His friend, his only friend, Hungry Paul. Hungry Paul is a casual postman, which is a job I used to do, which is basically that, when somebody rings in sick on a Monday morning, they read the casual postman to come out and do the shift for the day. So that's the only job he does. He does it about 3 Mondays a month, and that's it. So this little section just has him on his rounds, gets across some, I suppose, the philosophy of the book. Hungry Paul continued on his rounds, his bag getting lighter and lighter, doing a job that has existed, largely unchanged, for hundreds of years. To any busy person, burdened with all of life's responsibilities and preoccupations, Hungry Paul's lot would seem a bearable one. He didn't have to decide which of a patient's limbs to amputate first, or where to invest the life savings of a company's pensioners. There was no pressure to report fourth quarter losses to the higher-ups in HQ, or force feed cold carrots to a fevered toddler. His job, on the few days he did it, involved no agonising decisions or regrets that might spoil the conversation over dinner. And yet, in modern vernacular, postal work is the profession that has become synonymous with violent meltdowns. Why would this happen in such an apparently placid line of work, which involves chatting happily to the householders and performing a task that has, throughout history, been shown to be helpful in all ways? Most overworked middle managers would gladly swap their late evening conference calls with the West Coast for the simplicity of the postal worker, walking in the mixed March sunshine alone with his thoughts. However, while such white-collar fantasies fail to consider what it is that bends even the most pacific minds towards self-destruction. Though we may be a species that prizes great minds, we are also terrified of and by our thoughts. In prisons, the most extreme and austere punishment that is meted out to errant prisoners, those whose behaviour exceeds even the diabolical standards of incarcerated society, is solitary confinement, the awful fate of being imprisoned with only one's thoughts for company. With no distractions, one thought billiards another, and an endless internal monologue drowns out the rest of life, bringing dissonance to silence, restlessness to stillness, and anxiety to forethought. A certain type of person, isolated and unsuited to long daily periods of reflection, will eventually think themselves to madness. But Hungry Paul seemed to be able to maintain his peace, where another man might have declared war on themselves and those around him. What did he think about? The answer is quite simply nothing. Hungry Paul had been blessed with a mental stillness which became his natural state over the years. His mind worked perfectly fine, and he had all the faculties of a healthy, if slightly unorthodox man of his age. He just had no interest in or capacity for mental chatter. He had no internal narrator. When he saw a dog, he just saw a dog, without his mind adding that it should be on a lead, or that its tongue was hanging out like a rasher. When he heard an ambulance siren, he just heard an ambulance siren, without noting its Doppler effect, or wondering if it was a real emergency, or just a driver running late for dinner. And it is in this way that hungry Paul maintained a natural clarity throughout his day, and stayed apart from the trouble that the world will undoubtedly make for those who look for it. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that lovely reading. I don't even know where to begin. It's such a surprising book, I think. It's such an unusual book. When you think my two heroes will be men in their 30s who are still living at home with their mothers, but are quite happy with that. It's, you know, and yet it seems to have struck a major chord. I mean, I see so many people online in book discussions just saying, this helped get me through a difficult time during the lockdown and all that. So I'm wondering where the impulse came from to put the magnifying glass over two characters like that, sort of sidelined, quiet characters, but content characters, really.
Yeah, I think I'd begun to notice sort of quiet people over time. I remember I was in work. I work as a civil servant, and I was in the lift during a particularly busy time. It was about 10 years ago when I had just taken on more responsibility in work. My kids are very young. And I had no ambition to be a writer at this stage, by the way. I had no plans to be a writer. That only came a few years ago, really. And I was in a lift, and there was a guy I see in work, a very cheerful sort of guy, and he was reading a book. And I was kind of nosy about the book and the book was Superman. And my sort of book snobbery kicked in. And then when I got out of the lift, I was like, well, he's happy and I'm not happy. So who's the smart guy now? So I suppose it's one of those things. It's like, they say you buy a red car and all of a sudden you notice every red car you see in the street. So you start noticing quiet people. And I began to wonder whether what they have is what's sort of missing in the world. That, we know that confident people and loud people, we know what they think because they tell us, and, whether we like it or not. And there just seemed to be a lot of that in the world. And I think there was maybe a bit of a cacophony in my own head. And I started to think about the people who'd made a difference in my life over the years. And that began a sort of process of just noticing this. That, as I say, was going on for about 5 years before I started trying to write about it. So, but that meant when I did eventually sort of become pregnant with the character who became Leonard, that was sort of fully formed for me there. And that became the thing that, without planning to, that I ended up wanting to explore.
So Leonard came before Hungry Paul in your imagination? Yeah, because it struck me again that I know that there's a tradition, I suppose, if you want to put it that way, of the two outsiders or the two outcasts or the two people like, Estragon and Vladimir or Adam and Paul or whatever, even Lauren and Hardy, people like that. They get on and they have that thing going between them, I suppose. You have a wonderful description. I mean, I know it's not a spoiler alert because we've seen that Leonard's mother dies when he's in his 30s. But Helen, you've one. I'm just going to read it out because it's such a beautiful line. It's a tiny little line early on that sums up for me just. I thought it was on page 9, hold on. Yeah, so she's just giving Leonard some advice. Move to Bahamas, right on the beach, said Helen, who had spent her career lobbing encouragement in soft little underarm pitches for others to swing at. So that was just such a lovely line. And so we get this pair, and they get on, and yet there are differences between them. I mean, that's one of the things that was fascinating to me. I mean, the casual postman, he has this sort of zen calm. He almost doesn't need to think, whereas Leonard is all imagination. You know, it's wonderful that his job is to write text for children's encyclopedias, and yet he's not allowed to write what he wants to write. He has to do it secretly. So can you talk about the differences between them? Because I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think to some extent, when I started out and when I was writing it, I was thinking, oh, it's like a cell splitting here, you know, where Hungry Paul was going to be some sort of spin-off to Leonard, you know, when he sort of came into the story. And I suppose I began to think early on about the fact that I'd have to show the characters not only as themselves, but also show what other people brought out of them. So I had to in order to see the character fully, I had to put them in different combinations, and we would then, almost like walking around a statue, get a better sense of who they were. Because we all have a sense of who we are individually. And to some extent, a lot of personal development is very focused on what we're like as individuals. But actually, I think in my own life, a lot of my growth has come about by being around people who've, you know, turned on certain genes in my head, or whatever, you know, that's what it felt like. So I began to think about that sort of connection where Hungry Paul is a very self-sufficient person. At some stage in the book, it says almost to the point of obliviousness. Whereas Leonard kind of has one foot in Hungry Paul's world and one foot in the sort of more familiar everyday world. And he sort of straddles that, and he's a little bit unsure of how to handle himself. And I think he gets something from both sides to his personality. But I often say in the book, I think, as you said there, you know, they're two guys live at home in their early 30s. Like, I always think if you were to say to a woman, like, you know, I've got this guy for you, you know, he lives at home, he's with his mother, he works 3 days a month, what do you think? She'd be like, you're all right. And I think to some extent the characters all change, except for Hungry Paul. I think it's the reader who changes with Hungry Paul. Because Hungry Paul, in a way, you know, I think at times of difficulty and crisis, whether in your personal life or in the world, there's a real temptation to focus on what's changing. You know, and in news we do it all the time. We always focus on what's new, what's changing, whereas we overlook what's not changing. And I think that's something that Leonard and Hungry Paul share together. They both value what doesn't change in life. What's perennial. And I suppose another word for that is perspective. You know, that you're able to see what's happening in the world, but against a huge wall of you know, unchanging certainty. Like so much of the world is the same. Maybe that's why in lockdown and so on, people liked that about the book. There was so much that changed in people's lives. And the things people hung on to were, you know, nature, you know, family, and books, because books are always there. That's one of the great virtues that Hungry Paul has as a person, if you like. No one say as a written character, but one attribute he has is he's always around. You know what I mean? Like if you go into the kitchen and you're looking for a chat, he's just there. And I think there's a lot to be said for just being around in life, actually, in relationships, just being there.
I kind of got the impression, I'm not sure if I'm correct here, that Hungry Paul, the reason Hungry got attached to his name in my head was he was almost like the runt that doesn't quite get fed. Because really, like, he has a sister and he has a mother that seem to be looking out for him from the get-go and are worried about him and are concerned as if he's not self-sufficient, which is kind of interesting. Isn't that where the fish comes from? She takes him to an aquarium and sees this. She gets a question, what's your favourite fish? And she sees this ugly fish struggling along the top, an angelfish or something, and she goes, oh, yeah, that's my favourite fish. Kind of half looking at him, the little kid, like, you know, she's going to be looking out for him.
Yeah, that section, originally when we got the covers for the book, my publisher said, oh, we've like half a dozen covers, we'll see if you pick the same one we pick. And I went, I don't like any of them, actually. So he said, okay, well, then you have to come up with something. And I was trying to think what image. And actually, it's a section of the book, it's before Hungry Paul was born, actually. It's when they're just as a couple. Helen is his mother, and Peter is his father. And they're at an aquarium, not unlike, this is a bit of local tie-in, not unlike the one in Bray. And there is actually, I think, a sunfish in the sea life. Yeah, and if you ever seen a sunfish it looks like a severed head basically, and it can't really propel itself. It's just this big. They're huge, about the size of a fireplace, and they just float through the sea and eat jellyfish. And Helen picks it as her favorite in the aquarium, and the reason she picks it is because she can't bear the thought that there's a creature that will go unloved, that it wouldn't be that would be nobody's favorite. And Hungry Paul is her sunfish. That's where it comes from. Yeah. So yeah, he's the Hungry Paul. My top of my FAQ, I always say I must get the domain name. Only the narrator calls him that, because he's unnamed in the book except for the narrator, who only calls him Hungry Paul, and it's not explained in the book. And one of the reasons for that is that there aren't many physical descriptions. There's no place names in the book. There's no surnames. And it's because when you're dealing with quiet people, they're so easily crowded out or overtaken, and it's so easy to use shorthand to boil someone down to sort of a simplistic few traits. So he's not named in the book, and that's not explained, because if the book were to end, if it were to end, and that's why it's called Hungry Paul, you'd be sort of almost validating the idea that you can reduce somebody to that, whereas leaving it unexplained. Because it's not really a descriptor. Like if I said, which one's David? Oh, he's the hungry one over there. Or he must be my husband. He's a hungry person. It's not really a descriptor. Where it came from, actually, my wife's has a bus driver uncle who has two friends, Tall Paul and Hungry Paul. And so that's, whenever I heard that, I thought, oh, that's a good name. Or if ever I need a name.
And then my last question before we move to Nora. It's a book of also the sort of crises that happen, are kind of very identifiable, very quiet crises, like Leonard, the first time he meets Shelley, he's at work, he's wearing his pajama top, and he's thinking back, oh my God, how could I do that? Or Paul's sister is getting married, and he's supposed to go with the guest, as is Leonard, so they say, will you be my guest? These are the sort of, or there's a wonderful moment when Paul, he has to bring a tin of sweets to the hospital, and he's concerned that they're out of date. They're a year out of date, and he goes and he complains in the shop. And of course, it's his mother's sewing basket he's taken by mistake. But they're the sort of crises that happen in this. And it struck me, I was again trying to think of why this has struck such a chord and why this appeals so much. And I could be off the mark here, but it's a book about innocence, in the same way that something like Forrest Gump is about a very innocent character that therefore we just feel empathy for, or we feel, it's very rarely that we see a story that innocence is celebrated.
Yeah, I think to some extent that probably comes from, it was written after almost a decade of me reading children's books to my kids, like even the omniscient third-person narrator is kind of not really that fashionable as a sort of writing technique, but a lot of children's books are written that way. And in children's books as well, it's not enough to sort of say the world's a crappy place. You do have to sort of show them, you don't have to simplify it, but you do have to show a way of being in the world. You do have to say, without being saccharine about it, that for all the difficulty in the world and for all the facts and reality of the world, and without trying to simplify it, that it is still possible and there are still ways to be in the world. It's funny, just as you mentioned those two examples, my father-in-law came down to the house the night before last, and he was wearing a sort of sweatshop. It's not unlike the one Finbar's wearing, actually, so there's, I don't know if you want to do a twirl, but like, in other words, a couple of buttons at the top and then up ones. And my son came down in his pajamas, and it was the same top. And as well, I'm going to a wedding on Wednesday, and I'm my brother's +1. Okay. So like Leonard and Hungry Paul is coming true, these kind of facts. But yeah, I think the innocence is there, and I think Leonard has that as well. Like I think what you heard in the opening section there, his sort of fascination with children's encyclopedias, and then he goes on to become a ghostwriter of children's encyclopedias. I think what he has going for him is that he never lost that sort of connection. And I think actually, I'm 46 now, and I think when I only started writing about 4 or 5 years ago. So I think in my 40s, I did sort of, I decide I needed a bit of levity in my life. Because I think life can get very serious. If your parents are not well, kids are very busy, work is very busy, if you're not careful. So I think that little bit of silliness or innocence has actually really helped me in my 40s, I think, to get more out of life. Because I think it could have otherwise gone the other direction, where I just would have become quite heavy, I think.
Great, that's terrific. Thank you very much. You're allowed to clap now if you want. Can I invite Nuala up to read?
Hi everyone, and thanks for coming. I have a tendency to read the same bit of this all the time, so I'm going to read something different tonight instead. So just to give you a tiny bit of background, Joyce and Nora left Dublin in October 1904, having known each other 4 months. And we find them here then in Pola. Jim is working teaching English, and Nora is newly pregnant with their son, Giorgio. She's about 4 months pregnant. She got pregnant straight away, essentially. And this is Jim's birthday. It's the 2nd of February, 1905. We take a steamboat out to the island of Brioni Grande, and it chugs gracefully across the strait. Jim stands by the rail, smoking and observing the glassy sea, and I sit on a bench and do the same. Brioni Grande is famous for cheese, Fräulein Globocnik says, and makes no other remark. I take in her neat grey dress and the way that her skin almost matches it in colour. She's a plain woman, to be sure, though she could be a little lovely if she tried. Mr. Ayres gawks at her, then resumes staring off into the distance in that brooding way of his. When the Fräulein wanders to the rail to watch the water, Ayres slides up behind her and stands very close. I see him put his hand to her waist, and she shrugs him off. He sneaks up beside her again, and I smile to watch this awkward little pursuit. Then the Fräulein turns her head and says something sharp to Ayres, and he nods curtly and walks away. I wish he'd leave Fräulein Globocnik be and stop his pestering. Once off the boat, Ayres, the Fräulein and Jim are determined to see the ruins of the Roman villa up the coast, but after a while I can't walk much further. I spy a nice flat rock with a view of the bay, and I sit. I'm going to stop here, Jim, and catch my breath, I say. I'll stay with you, Signora Joyce, Fräulein Globocnik says. No, I want to rest my toes, I say. You go ahead with the others. Jim idles by me too, though I can tell he's dying to walk on. Off with you, I say, for he loves to look at old buildings and talk of their history with those who know about such things. Jim kisses my hand, and I watch him saunter on with the Fräulein and Ayres, and it occurs to me how very much at ease he looks on this white rock in the Adriatic Sea, in his pale suit and hat. He has grown a moustache of which he's very proud, and he worries it will tiddle my nose and make me sneeze when we kiss, but I haven't the cruelty to tell him that the moustache is such a wisp of a thing that I can't feel it at all. Jim thinks himself a very pretty man, and so he is, and today there is a gleam of happiness about him. The Fräulein keeps step beside Jim, and in her utilitarian grey she really does seem rather mannish, and I wonder if she loves women, as Jim has hinted to me, and if so, what happens when they lie together? Do they crawl over each other's bodies as Jim and I do? Are mouths and fingers enough? I'd miss the hard, sure strength of him, and the closeness of the joining of two bodies, Jim's manine up inside me and me moving over it. It's the nearest to uplifted I've ever felt. I unpin my hat and wave its brim in front of my face, though it's a cool day. My thoughts alone often heat me now that I'm with child, and I can't get enough of Jim. We tear at each other 2 and 3 times a night, so that I can hardly walk in comfort most days until evening time. Jim, the Fräulein and Ayres disappear through the spruce trees, and I lift my face to the sun, so ever present in this part of the world, and wonder if I miss Ireland at all. I don't miss the Galway rain, and I don't feel any backward pull to Dublin's dirt and the constancy and drudge of the work I did at Finn's Hotel. Jim told me that his brother Stanny went to Finn's at his request to see if they were angry with me for leaving so abruptly. And all they said was, "Miss Barnacle is gone away," as if I had stepped off the face of the planet never to return. But yes, excuse me, but yes, I suppose that's right. Miss Barnacle is gone away, and there's a new woman in her place now. I am a wife of sorts, and a soon-to-be mother. I'm not Nora of Galway or Miss Barnacle of Dublin. I'm Signora Joyce of Europe, and I feel I'm happier than I've ever been to be just that. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Nuala, as you know, 20 years ago, I was education officer in the Joyce Centre, and I'm aware of the absolute wealth of material there is there on Joyce and on his life and all the entourage around him. And you've an account by his brother Stan, you know, my brother's keeper. You have an account by Frank Budgeon, etc., etc. The voice that's missing from all those is Nora's voice. How did you come to construct her actual voice? How did that imagination work for you, trying to figure out how she spoke?
There are letters extant from Nora, and in a very Molly Bloomy way, they're unpunctuated. So her letters run on, jumping from topic to topic, and she's quite self-effacing in her letters. She makes jokes against herself, like, "Oh, you know me, I don't like too much walking," or whatever it is she's saying about herself. So we kind of have her voice. It's not stilted letter writing in that she doesn't put on her schoolgirl hat. It's quite natural and normal and the usual "God bless you all" sort of stuff that you find in emigrant letters. And then we have what Joyce said about her earthiness, her loyalty, her courage. We have what their friends said, Mary and Porrick Column, the friends that they knew in Paris, like Arthur Power, all talked about her stout-heartedness, her good grace, her charisma, her good humour. And then I had my Galway friends, and I basically mined their vocabulary for Galway words. I've lived in Galway now for 26 years, I think, and you know, they use the diminutive brought over from Irish, the "een" on the end of everything. So every little boy is a little maneen, and every little girl is a little girleen. And so I gave Nora the pet name Gooseen and put it into Jim's mouth. I use phrases like "span new," which is a Galway phrase meaning brand new. So I brought it in as best I could. I could have used Molly Bloom's soliloquy and mined it. I only took one phrase from it and I left the rest because I know that Molly is an amalgam, and Joyce said she was. She's not Nora per se. She's from Dublin/Gibraltar. Nora Barnacle was a Galway city woman, so she had to sound something like that. So yeah, it's a matter of sort of weaving and concocting, and then as long as the tone of it sounds okay to my ear, then I can sort of jump in and start and keep going, you know. Also, reading Joyce's other works and going to Joyce plays, you hear a lot of phrases, and I would sit in theatres and jot down phrases from Portrait or whatever play we were at, and yeah, just a kind of a mishmash of stuff, I suppose, but a very enjoyable thing to undertake, to sort of try and embody this woman and empathise with her in her life, which wasn't terribly easy, though she loved him, and make that voice for her.
And then a second voice that's obviously very much there's a lot of reported conversations with Jim that are in it. Sometimes you quote his actual letters, like for example when he thought Vincent Cosgrave might be the father of Georgia, when he wrote this letter from Dublin, because a friend of his had told him that was the actual letter itself, was it? Or it was paraphrased, for privacy reasons. I wonder then, like, there's a few times when he's coming back drunk, trying to capture the Joyce way of speaking, my question would be, people would know what to expect, or they'd have their own opinion of how Joyce spoke, etc., etc. It must be hard not to walk the line between parody or pastiche almost. How tricky was that?
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to get it wrong. A lot of the stuff he says is from his letters to Stenny. And again, because even though Joyce's letters are not literary artefacts, they still belong to the estate. And so I wasn't able to, because they were only published in 75, a lot of them, I wasn't able to quote them, so I had to rewrite them. So I would just take the thrust of what he said and tweak it, you know, so that it was the same information but just slightly changed. Still in Dublinese. I'm from Dublin, so I can speak that. I'm fairly confident. My parents were brought up in Dublin, and they sort of lived a kind of a sheltered Catholic life, so their language didn't evolve much, even from their own parents' time. So I would know the English of Joyce from home, in a sense. I grew up in West Dublin. His family lived in Chapel Lizard for a long time, which is just down the road from us. So I was fairly confident with the Joyce language. The only recordings we have of Joyce, of course, is reading Finnegan's Wake, and he does this ridiculous sort of, and it's terrible, you know, and it's very the Queen's English. It's sort of like a recitation voice he uses. So I think we can rest assured he did not speak like that. So again, you're trying to give a voice to someone who went to Clongowes Wood, who went to Belvedere, who went to UCD, who'd had his little spell in Paris, who was a linguist, who loved and revered language as a sacred thing, and bring all of that into it. They can't sound like each other. They weren't alike. In most ways, they weren't alike. They had things in common that bound them, but they weren't like each other. But again, they were both great talkers and both great storytellers, so they delighted in each other, I think, and in each other's way of speaking.
And I always imagine, I could be wrong, as you say about the actual recordings, but Joyce was so close to his father, as in a lot of ways, of speaking and telling jokes, and he admired a lot about him, even though he was such a waster, that I imagine he had the Cork inflection going on as well, you know, because that's where John Stanislaus was from.
A lot of Cork phrases in his vocabulary. I know Flicka Small from Cork wants to ramp up the Cork side of Joyce, and rightfully so. He was half Cork after all, you know. He didn't go there much. He didn't travel outside Dublin much at all in his life. So he didn't know Galway, which must have made Nora seem like a great exotic when she landed in front of him. And then when he got to go there, he was very, very charmed by Galway, by the islands, by the races, by his trip out to Uachtarard, the whole lot, out to Clifton too. But yeah, the Cork side is very interesting, and more to come, I'm sure, on that.
And then the next question, I suppose, is you're taking a very well, as I said, a very well documented period of 1904 up to Joyce dies 1941, and then you have a brief coda at the end when it's terrible when Giorgio reports on the state of Lucia, that she's now grey-haired and the things it's awful. In terms of selecting material and selecting moments and selecting times, when I looked through it and when I read it, it does seem to hit everywhere pretty much, as opposed to, like, for instance, when I was interviewing Colin Tobin last year on The Magician, he might miss out 10 years in Thomas Mann and just concentrate on this, miss out 5 years. Yours seemed to be more like a diary that almost wanted to document. Is there a certain extent that's true? And how did your selection process work? Let me put it that way.
I suppose because I don't really have any interest in plot, I had to pick plotty things, in a sense, where things were happening, where it's obvious Lucia is sick, or the time she has the date with Beckett, or when Giorgio decides he's going to have this relationship with Helen Castor, who's married and years older than him. So you pick the plottiest bits. I had loads of other stuff in it. I had the time they did the play in Zurich, the Sing play, and my editor took it out, didn't move the plot on. I had 2 what I thought were great scenes with Nora on her own or with Lucia, where Nora had loads of agency, was doing her own thing. Jim was nowhere in sight. And again, my editor ditched them. They weren't moving things along. Whereas I loved that was Nora on her own. And, you know, a couple of readers have pointed out that everything is to do with her and him. And I was like, yeah, well, blame my editor. That wasn't me. That wasn't my choice. You know, the editor is in the business of selling the book to her sales team and her marketing team and her boss. And she has to say, well, this is what's going to sell it. It's James Joyce, but it's from the point of view of the wife, you know. And even to the extent that they put a little explanatory line on the cover. So, what do you call it? A subtitle. So I had called the book Nora, plain and simple. They put in a love story of Nora Barnacle and James Joyce because they had to shoehorn him onto the cover somehow. And I was in a little bit of a fury about that. A love story, I thought people will think this is a romance, and it's not. You know, this wasn't a romantic relationship, it was a difficult relationship. But I sort of have grown to accept it in that, yes, it was love. It was just a love that was flexible and flawed, and maybe that's the best kind of love, you know. They stayed through the whole lot, all of the difficulties. A lot of women wouldn't have stayed with a man like that, but she did. She was very, very loyal.
Yeah, bad husband, bad father. And it's often the... Well, yeah. I mean, it's the little vivid moments that really jump out sometimes, like one of the many times that he'd promised that he'd go back on the wagon, etc., and then he went onto this battleship, I think it was, and he got drunk, had to be carried home, and then when they put leeches on his eyes, I mean, imagine that. That's when he got the horrors and said, okay, I'm really staying off it this time. They're vivid details. That probably answers my question. I did wonder about beginning a book, the book Nora, pretty much when she meets Joyce at the age of 22, as if he'd almost conjured her into being, but I suppose that might have been an editorial choice.
It was my choice. Yeah, it was my choice. Initially, I thought I was going to write the story of Nora and Joyce to Joyce's death, but then obviously you fall in love with your characters, and I needed to bring her to her end 10 years later. But I did always have the idea of starting on the first Bloomsday, the day that Ulysses is set, the day that he commemorated so beautifully for her, honouring her in that book. I mean, this is what you're doing, aren't you? You're choosing a moment to shine your torch on, and I thought this is the right moment to begin, because then you can weave the backstory in a little bit afterwards. I had an editor once who didn't like backstory, and so everything had to be chronology. It drove me bananas, but this editor was great. She was really sort of, I felt trusted, you know. She let me do what I wanted to do, and even though she's based in New York and is a New Yorker herself, she had no problem with my Hiberno English and my funny phrasings. She would just kind of ask me to prove that they were real, that I wasn't making them up off the top of my head. And if I could do that, then it was grand.
And that kind of brings me neatly to a question I'm going to be kind of asking both of you, which is, I understand, Nuala, that your first publisher wasn't particularly thrilled with this idea, and they found a different publisher. They thought it mightn't be a big seller, and they proved so wrong. Was it a difficult sell?
I think my agent was astonished when both of the publishers I was with rejected this novel. She couldn't see, after all of the Paris Wife and Mrs. Hemingway and Zelda and all those books had done so brilliantly, the books about the wives essentially, she was astonished that people didn't want this. And I think it's a sort of an allergy to Joyce and a sort of a fear of Joyce was the conclusion she came to. But one of my publishers, which was the one in London, said it was too literary. And the one in the States, they had first refusal on it, let me put it that way. I think that editor and I didn't see eye to eye, and so we were kind of at the point where it was probably better if we parted ways, and we did. But it meant that having finished the book, we were then in a position of having to sell the book again, which takes a long time, months and months and months. So this book has been a long time with me, you know, and then I've been a long time talking about it. So it's been quite the relationship, you know, probably the longest relationship I've had with a book. You yeah, so it's been kind of strange. But yeah, it's very disappointing. And people think, I think, when you've reached a certain level, so this is book 16 for me. I've had poetry collections and short story collections published with Alan in Ireland House and with New Island in Dublin. People think that because you're published X amount of times, you don't get rejected, but a lot of writers do. I was talking to a writer the other day who people would know is well established, and she told me her latest book has been rejected and she's back to square one, and she's devastated. She's now starting to think, will I go on? I don't know, you know. And this does happen to writers who are long in the tooth, and it's very difficult to talk about these things in a public forum because you sound like a whinger because you've had some success. And you're frightening people who are at the start, you know. But I think we're better served if we're honest about the difficulties involved in various aspects of publishing.
Great, yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, I mean, I know what you're talking about. Rónán, I'm wondering, this was your debut novel, and I'm wondering how, I don't know, you're sending out this, and there's no obvious crisis or plot points or whatever it is that I would imagine people would be responding, why aren't you doing this, or whatever, as a sell. Was this a difficult manuscript to sell, or was there how did it work?
It was just very different. Like, my publisher is Blue Books, so like it's a husband and wife team, and my editor is the main publisher's mother-in-law, so Heather's mother, and she's like a 74-year-old former professional wrestler. She was a wrestler in the days of like Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks. So it's just a different buzz. When I was writing the book, I saw interviews with Donal Ryan and Kit Duval, both of whom got published with their second books. In Donal's case, his first book then got published. I'm not sure about Kit. I don't think she went back to the first one. So I said I'd write one book. If that wasn't published, I'd write a second one. If that wasn't published, I wouldn't do it anymore. So anyway, when I was working on Leonard and Hungry Paul, I read a book called Man with a Seagull on His Head by Harriet Page, who's an English writer. That's her only book. She was published by Blue Moose, which is my publisher in Hebden Bridge. And I read that and I said, oh, that sounds like it's kind of from the similar solar system. So in the back of my mind, I looked up, because Blue Moose were going about 10 years, they'd remortgaged their house to launch the publisher. And I thought, well, ideally I'd like to be published by them. Like, you know, like any writer, I wouldn't have minded being published by, you know, a Rat Poison company if they were the only one who would have me. But, so yeah, I just sent it to Kevin on a Friday night, which is a terrible time to send a book. I just sent him on a Friday. And the Saturday, he was walking his dog, so I got an email at 7 o'clock saying send me the rest of it. And then he tweeted the following Friday saying, I've just finished the manuscript, can't wait to tell the whole world about it. And it was a line from Leonard and Hungry Paul. So I said, holy shit. I rang my wife, and then I was in Books upstairs in Dublin, and he sent me an email with a mini review about the books. I turned up a phone call tonight, so I did a phone call and signed a book. And that was it. So I know it's having said that, had they not picked it up, I'm not sure who would have. You know, there were like other publishers afterwards came, and I think had I gone, you know, bigger publishers wanted to buy it then to do like a mass market paperback. But I just wanted to, like, I'm back from the independent music scene with my background, so I figured publishing wasn't that different to music, and I knew the horror stories of major labels, so I thought I've always liked that. In February I'll be 30 years creatively active from the start of my music career to now, so I've been on the go for 30 years. So I'm reasonably exposed to what can go right and wrong. So I'd rather work with a small number of people for a long time if I can. And then, you know, I think in fairness to Kevin and to Blue Moose, they've never sort of asked me, like they did, I think when I submitted Panenka, which is a book that has football in it, you know, they signed the book without asking what it was about. They just said, okay. And I said, well, I have another one called Ghost Mountain. They said, okay, we'll do that, two of them. So then he had the title to go off. And he still doesn't know what Ghost Mountain's about, actually, even though I finished it. And finished the first draft of it. So they just kind of work differently. Like when you're dealing with like the Blue Moose, there is a lot of money on the table when you're starting, so it's not a financial risk. And they're really just looking for writers that they can work with for a long time. And a lot of writers, like last year, they just published women writers, and they were all women in their 40s and 50s who were on their third, fourth, fifth, sixth books. So not debuts, not, and they will essentially say, we believe in this writer, and just let them do what writers do. And then the corollary of that is editorial challenge. So with my editor, we have a very good relationship, but she does push me, and in a nice way. Like one of her phrases is, not up to your usual standard or something like that. So it's a different. I suppose I don't have an agent, and I'm not really. Like I have had conversations. I remember one agent asked me a little bit about Ghost Mountain, and I told them about 2 or 3 sentences, and they were like, "That just sounds bonkers." Like an English person, bonkers. I'm like, but you like the first 2 books. Why did you just say like, I like the first 2? Just keep going. You know what I mean? Like I don't understand. Like I've been listening a lot to The Fall lately, the English band, and they did whatever 30 odd albums, always different, always the same, and I think that's not a bad way to be.
I've about 10 more questions, but I really better open it to the public, because I'm sure you've all got your own thoughts or questions to put to these two. Anyone like to go?
Can I ask Nuala, did you like, as you started writing in the first few chapters of the book, did you like the 2 main characters, and had your feelings changed by the end of the book towards them?
Yeah, I mean, I knew a good bit about them anyway because I'd read the biographies, and then obviously I had to go back into them and read more biographies and letters and all of that. So I started out thinking Nora was fantastic, and I was still a bit unsure about Jim, I was still a bit kind of annoyed with him. But by the end, I loved both of them more, and I empathised more with him. I could understand him more as an artist and as a man by the end. I think there's a lot of bad press about him. Apart from the genius of the books, I think there's a lot of bad press about his personal life. But I found a very loving and tender father in the letters. Reading their family letters, the family language between them, the in-jokes, the tenderness, really made me understand him more. He was a very sensitive individual. He may have annoyed people in his sort of persecution complexes, etc., but I just felt great empathy for him and for her by the end. So yeah, they've an even bigger place in my heart now.
Anyone else? What changed after you won the award for the One Book Award? Did you see much difference or anything?
I had a bestseller for the first time ever. That was great. I mean, the book had done well when it came out the previous year? Yeah. In the sense of it got good reviews and it sold well-ish, but then One Dublin One Book, because everybody was encouraged to read the book, they actually went out and bought it this time. So, yeah, that was the first time that it happened to me that I got into the bestsellers chart, so that was fun. The first time I've made a bit of money off a book in Ireland. The States, the advances are bigger in the States than they are here, significantly bigger. So the States has always been good to me in that sense, but so this was the first time in Ireland, so that felt great.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things about One Dublin One Book is that it's genuinely a sort of reading project, so it's not just a lot of radio shows and profile. It does translate into people actually reading the book, and when you do the events with a lot of book clubs, libraries, and I really enjoyed that, the idea that the book was having a life, and I think maybe having got that sort of recognition might just help with the longevity of the book, that it will be read for a bit longer. It'll be in people's lives a bit longer. That's what I hope happens anyway.
Right, we've probably time for one more. Yeah, sure.
It's not a question
Your chapters are lovely. They're kind of short and discrete moments, and I'm just wondering about how you wrote them, and if you kind of wrote each one in one sitting, and if you got planned out in advance, or did you sit at your desk and one of the moments you chose it there? Sorry, just curious about how.
Yeah, I'm more naturally a short story writer. So I originally conceived of this book as a novella in flash. I wanted to write a very short book consisting of standalone flash chapters. And then it just morphed into this enormous thing. And some of the chapters are very, very short and some are a bit longer. So a lot of them, yes, I would write in one sitting. And then the ones that needed more time, like the one about the affair and stuff like that, it just needed more time. But yeah, not to be trashing, well, this is going out online, is it? No, I won't trash anybody. Some editors don't like that story-like feel to chapters. They much prefer a through thread with everything, whereas I like discrete chapters. And a lot of readers have thanked me for my short chapters because it means they can consume the book in a more rational and reasonable way in bed or on the train or whatever it is. So I love short chapters as a reader. And so for me, it's a gift to my readers that they're short so that they're consumable in a way that, the way you consume a short story, it's down and you think about it and you digest it for a while and then you move on. It's that sort of idea.
Okay, that's absolutely terrific, guys. I'm sure they'll both be more than happy to sign copies, which Dubray are looking at after over here, if you'd like to purchase any of these. And can we have a warm round of applause for our two authors, please?